I am now just going to hand it off to our chief soil health trainer, who is Bianca Movius-Clune. Again, she introduced herself yesterday. We are very excited to have her expertise at AFT. And as she mentioned yesterday, she was formerly she was the founding director of the NRCS Soil Health Division. So it's great to have her and other members of her team, which include Bonnie, who you get this morning, and Rachel. So with that, Bianca, I'm just turning things over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. And I love being at AFT because I get to interact across all of these different disciplines. You know, it's one of the things that I feel like we do well at AFT is everybody's got their expertise, everybody shares it. We don't have silos the way I've seen in a lot of other places. And so we can do stuff like this where audiences that have not generally worked on soil health, well, we can provide you with soil health insights and hopefully you'll provide us with insights back. I'm going to let you know right now that if any of this training gets your juices flowing and you're feeling like, gosh, there's this gap, I really want to hear about this more, we could do that. If there are particular topics you want to know more about, definitely do get in touch. Also, if any of it doesn't quite work for you, I'm very open to feedback. I would love to hear from you what worked, what didn't work, how we can do this better, what particular topics are even more of interest to you, anything like that. So with that, I'm also going to say I do not have a second monitor today. And so I will do what I can here with one monitor, which means I won't be able to see you. So Chris, that Clementine isn't going to do the trick. So you'll have to speak up. Hopefully it'll all work. Let's see. So I have a strange sharing menu that I haven't seen before. That's odd. Okay, here we go. All right. So let's see if I can make this work. Okay. Do you all see my screen, but not yourselves?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, good. So gonna launch right in. Soil health is definitely my passion. I hope you all will see that and that you all learn something exciting today that has you go back to your land trusts, your respective organizations with new motivation, new options, new ideas for what to do, and that we can work with you over the coming year and possibly beyond to help you really be that multiplier, hit the ground running, help farmers pick up soil health, guide them to the right resources. You know, when I got to NRCS back in 2014, the soil health effort was just getting started. And now we've got basically an industry-wide, it seems like more and more people are aware of soil health. And I've never seen anything light a fire quite the way that soil health does. People get really excited about it. And I think it's because there's so many win-wins. You know, your farmer will economically do better. They will have lower risk. The environment will do better in a myriad of different ways that we'll cover of some today. It's just, there's so much impact and you can really address the root cause of a lot of our issues with it. So it's a path to stronger agriculture, right? And it's right there under our feet. And most of us think about soil as that thing that we step on, that thing that our plants grow in. But we don't often sort of imagine ourselves in that three-dimensional structure that's right there under us. And there's a lot going on. And we want to build up that structure to be high functioning and resilient and regenerative to build that up over time. So in this session today, we're going to talk about some of the basics of soil health. Why does it matter? Some of the practices that create healthy soils, some of the benefits of those healthy soils, and some of the barriers to adoption. That's a lot of topics. We could literally teach multiple college level courses on that, which I used to do before I went to NRCS. I was at Cornell University and taught a sustainable soil management class there. And so there's a lot here. I have tried to keep a lot of the lovely detail that's in soil health, but not make it too complex for what we have this morning. So I'm going to hopefully be able to reach those of you who have hardly ever looked into soil health, as well as provide something new to those of you who have been dealing with soil health for years. And those of you who have a lot of experience, please do feel free to chime in to share your experiences. I would love to hear what barriers you're running into, get additional tidbits. I am not a Midwesterner. I mostly worked in the Northeast early on, and some in the Midwest and some across the globe. But those of you who are farmers in the Midwest, I think that you will have some really great insights for the rest of the team. So, objectives for today. I would love for everybody to walk away being comfortable discussing with a landowner or anybody that you want to reach why soil health matters so much, what the benefits are. And it sounds from the survey like many of you are there with that. So hopefully it'll be a useful review. Maybe there'll be a few additional insights. What is soil health? We'll define it. How soil health relates to regenerative agriculture and climate resiliency. We'll talk a bit about that. And then soil health management systems, principles, and conservation practices that improve soil health. So we'll talk a bit about, once you have degraded soil, how do you bring it back? And why does that work that way? And then we'll talk about the barriers of adoption toward the end of my session, and really the entire session that Michelle and Ben and others will bring to you starting at the end of this session just before lunch today. I will give them a chance to give you a little bit of a sneak preview of their session, and then they will launch into more of that this afternoon. They're going to really tackle the economic barriers to adoption, because that's definitely one major one. So that's what's in store today. So I'll first talk about the introduction to the basics, the benefits of soil health. Then we'll talk about soil health management systems principles, and then barriers to adoption. So introduction. First, zooming all the way out, right? We have a lot of challenges for agriculture and for society at large. We have a changing climate. We know that that's happening. Whether somebody believes that it is human caused or not, it really doesn't matter. But we know that the climate is changing, and our farmers are taking the brunt of it. They are experiencing record-breaking fires and droughts and floods, and it's tough for farmers out there these days. And pests, diseases, all of that, it's really challenging, right? So we have that changing climate, and it affects society at large, right? We have population growth going on, and that means that we are losing our land. This is from Farms Under Threat. We are losing a lot of land to development, and you all are in that business doing really great work to try to protect that land. Food security, COVID really brought that home. The way that our supply chains are set up, the way that our food system is set up right now, combine that with all of the other challenges, there are some major food security issues in this country and on the globe. Farm economics is challenging. We have massive water quality and water quantity issues, and we're not making enough progress on those. Air quality issues, human health issues, consumer demand of our agriculture and what that means for the land base, loss of agricultural lands. I mean, the challenges abound. And then when we look at climate change, we know it's happening, and we may have some uncertainty as to what extent it's happening. And a lot of that is going to be based on whether we can solve it. And agriculture can actually be a major solution in that. And that's one of the spaces that I'm working in at AFT, is to help agriculture be a climate solution. And it's up to us whether we, go upward a little bit, go upward a lot more, and what that means for the planet. It's a big challenge for us. For our producers specifically, we've already talked about, climate change is really at the forefront of a lot of farmers' realities today. Water quantity and reliability is a really tough issue today, whether it's too much water in flooding scenarios like this, whether it's too little water and we can't produce the crops that we would otherwise produce. We have had many record-breaking droughts over the last years, and it's kind of scary out there for farmers. New pests, new diseases, new risks, old risks, prices, input prices are up, and especially with the war in Ukraine, they're up even more. Markets are tough. trying to help a farmer grow more diverse crops, which is really critical for resiliency, is really tough because often the markets aren't there. So that's a space that we need to work in. Loss of land is challenging for farmers as well as society at large. You know, many farmers don't have access to land, and especially our younger generations are having a really tough time getting access to land so that they can get into farming. Consumer needs, you know, how do we feed a growing population a healthy diet that keeps everybody healthy when our agriculture is set up the way that it is? So there's a lot of challenges out there, but some really exciting things are that soil health can actually be a solution to a lot of these issues. Not everything, soil health can't solve everything, but soil health is an incredibly hopeful opportunity because it really helps farms be resilient and more economical in these very trying times. I will be showing you here and there some side-by-side photos, and this is just a nice collage of some of those side-by-side photos of healthy soils versus not healthy soils, right? I mean, we've got a soil here that looks nice and dark and crumbly. We'd like to talk about, you know, chocolate and chocolate cake sometimes as a sign of a good healthy soil. And here you can see the soil is crusted over, it's got ruts, it looks like the water drips have eroded even those clods that were plowed up. That corn does not look great. You'll hear a story about that tomorrow. So in each of these photos, these soils are the same soil type. So they developed in the same landscape, right side by side. But management is the driving distance and difference in how these soils function. And so we'll see that over and over again. And we'll talk a lot more about that today and tomorrow. And hopefully you all will get to talk about that a lot over the coming years. So I like to put this quote up. Hugh Hammond Bennett was the founder of NRCS, of the Natural Resources Conservation Service, our funder for this training, this work that we're doing here right now. And back in 1943, he said, if we are bold in our thinking, courageous in accepting new ideas, and willing to work with instead of against our land, we shall find in conservation farming an avenue to the greatest food production the world has ever known, right? How visionary is that? That quote is as true today as it was back in 1943. And it drove the agency to where it is today, to do a lot of fantastic things in terms of providing that one-on-one assistance to farmers, financial assistance, technical assistance, to help farmers work with the land instead of against the land. And that vision is one that I would suggest is a really important one for us to kind of grapple with and really internalize, because I think right here is the crux of whether a farmer will or will not adopt a lot of the time, because initially it takes a change in thought, a change in perspective, and in willingness to see that if they haven't been doing this all along, there's good reason to transition to soil health management systems. And that really takes being courageous, because who's willing to admit their own mistakes, right? I mean, that's a tough thing to do. Who's willing to admit that, gosh, I didn't know how to do this yet? And yet that's how we learn, right? And all of us are there. And I think meeting a farmer in that often very vulnerable space of recognizing that they've done something the way that their dad did it, their grandpa did it, all of their generations before that might have done it that way, and yet right now it's degrading their land and they want to go elsewhere with how they manage that land, that can be tricky. And so I think this quote really exemplifies the change in paradigm, change in heart that often needs to precede changes of what a farmer actually does. And that's a transition that I think we as people can help with. And it takes some compassion, right? I mean, all of us have done things a certain way and then realize, gosh, I could do this a better way. And sometimes that's really exciting and sometimes maybe not so much. So I love this quote. I think it's a really great one. And this is where we need to go, right? We need to work with our land, not against nature, but with nature. And we can actually make a lot of difference in how that soil functions and how that soil continues to feed us in the long run. So functioning, what are some of those functions that we would like our soils to provide, right? There's a lot of things we expect from our soils. we expect them to produce food. All of us are well aware of that. A lot of feed, fiber, biofuels, a lot of medicines come from soil. That's a lot of functions right there, just to produce all of those things for human consumption. That's a lot we expect from our soils. Beyond that, there are additional functions, though, that our soils need to provide that we maybe spend a little less time thinking about. One of them is capturing, filtering, and storing water. As rain hits the ground, is it going to go in and become a valuable resource that our crop can use and that recharges our groundwater? Or is that drop going to hit, encounter a soil that it can't get into, run off, and cause a flood, right? That's the difference in soil function that we're looking at there for water. Water cycling is an incredibly important function of our soils. Cycling and recycling nutrients. It's not just about providing the fertilizer directly to the plant. Our soils have a lot to do with changing the structure of organic material and making those nutrients available to plants. Some plants, legumes, fix nitrogen. There's a lot of depth there, but cycling and recycling nutrients is a key piece of what our soils provide for our crops and therefore for us, because that's what is absolutely critical for producing food. Resilience to drought, flood, and temperature extremes, protecting plants from pathogens and stress. We'll talk a lot more about the biota in the soil. Detoxifying pollutants. There's a lot of pollutants and they can be held on tightly by soils. They can be broken down, some of them, not others. We can't break down metals, but a lot of organic pollutants can be broken down by certain microbes. Storing carbon and moderating the release of various gases. Right? I mean, we talk about climate change, and one of the key pieces is that our soils can hold tremendous amounts of carbon if we manage them right. And right now, our degraded soils are a potential massive reservoir that could hold a lot more carbon and that will make them function a lot better. So whether somebody wants to hear about climate change or not, soils can be a solution, and helping our farmers and ranchers transition to soil health management systems will, as a very nice side product that will help all of society, also store a lot of carbon. And that will help mitigate climate change at the same time as we are building that resilience for our farmers. Soils need to resist erosive forces, and soils are a habitat for biodiversity, and farm fields can have an incredible amount of biodiversity, especially below ground, and we'll get into that more. So for those of you who have never studied soils, here's my 1 or 2 minute little primer on soils. What's so special about soils? And why is it so important that they're healthy? What is soil anyway, right? Soil, I like to think of as an interface and a foundation, right? Soil is at the foundation of everything we do and all of that keeps us alive. We could not survive on this planet without soils. That soil is an interface that is connected to all of life on Earth, all of our air resources, our water resources, our minerals. Soil is where everything comes together and where all of that function that we're looking for from our soils are created in that interaction, right? So we've got soils forming from minerals, life interacting with those soils and depositing organic matter, creating aggregates. We'll talk more about those. There's gaseous exchange, there's emissions to the atmosphere, and there's energy exchange happening. There are gases that are taken back up into the soil. Water is cycled and stored and evaporated to the atmosphere, right? There's so much interchange going on from our soil to all of these other resources. So it is that interface, and it is a foundation to all of life. What exactly is soil? You pick up a handful of soil. Very simplistically, we can look at this pie chart here and say, well, soils are about half generally mineral and organic matter. That changes depending on how dense the soil is. And then the other half is pore space, and that pore space holds air and water and various nutrients and minerals and biota. All the living organisms that live in soil are living in those empty spaces. The average soil, sort of looking across the globe, might have a few percent organic matter, 2, 3, 4, or 5% organic matter. And how much organic matter is there really drives function. You'll see it's a very small sliver of that total pie, but that organic matter really drives how well our soils function. And so it's a big piece of what we focus on when we talk about soil health is how do we build organic matter? How do we make it quality organic matter? How do we use it to get a really great habitat for the soil organisms that are there that create a lot of the function? And this empty space, man, there's a lot going on in those empty spaces. That's the most interesting part. Defining soil health, right? What's a healthy soil? We can all kind of relate to health when we think about our own bodies, whether we're getting a good diet, whether we're getting good exercise, whether everything is just kind of functioning, right? So when we define soil health is not an organism. Sometimes you might get a somewhat irritable scientist saying, soil health, it should be soil quality because soil is not an organism. Well, it's not an organism, but it's an ecosystem. And that ecosystem has to function. So NRCS defined soil health as the continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. And I'm going to point out a few key parts of this definition that are really important, right? It's the continued capacity. That capacity of the soil to function really needs to be sustained in the long run because it sustains everything, plants, animals, humans, microbes in the soil, everything that's alive on this planet, somewhere in there depends on soil. So that continued capacity of that soil to function as a vital living ecosystem, right? It is an ecosystem. There's lots of interaction going on, and all of those functions are absolutely critical. So we need to maintain that ecosystem, and farmers are the most active managers of the soil ecosystem. Our natural ecosystems kind of take care of themselves. They evolved that way. But people, as an integral part of the global ecosystem, have taken on a pretty significant role in very actively changing the ecosystems out there. So we have our agroecosystems, our agricultural ecosystems that have a lot of life in them, but we're expecting those ecosystems, those agroecosystems, to give us a lot of what we need to survive on this planet. So, yeah, if people left, everything else would be fine, everything would evolve. But really the core question is, are we going to manage our soils for resiliency so that we can continue to be part of this ecosystem? So one perspective I like to share is that an aggregate, a soil aggregate, is like a house, because then we can relate to it, right? The interesting stuff is going on in all these empty spaces. There are large pores. That's mostly where a lot of the water transfer happens. When it rains, the water infiltrates into the soil through those large pores. So guess what? If there's not open large pores at the surface, it's going to be much harder for that water to get in, therefore it runs off. That's where a flood comes from, right? We don't have control over the rain, but if we manage our soils to be able to take in large quantities of rainwater as it comes down, 2 inches per hour, 10 inches per hour, there are soils that can take up that much water. And if all of our soils were managed to be able to take in that much water, we'd have a lot less flooding in the world. So farmers can really play a key role. So those large pores are critical. The small and intermediate pores are more of our water storage pores. So we need those to be able to maintain that, water for when the next drought hits. And I'm saying it's like a house, right? So I've got our funny little, upside down home. Really think of soils as a megacity, because there are more organisms in a handful of soil than there are people on Earth. I'm going to say that again. There are more organisms in one handful of soil than there are people on Earth. So it's not just a house, it's a megacity. It's huge. There's a lot going on. And if we can work with that megacity of billions and billions of organisms that every farmer has to create the function we need, we will do excellently, right? So we really need to keep these empty spaces available for all of that life and the air and the water and nutrients and the organic matter that they eat to be able to keep them happy. Who all's down there? What's that look like? There's a whole soil food web down there, and I won't get into all the details, but some key things I want to point out, right? You see the sun here in the upper left of that picture. That's where all the energy comes from. All organic matter in the soil, all life in the soil depends on the sun's energy, and the way that they get access to that energy is because plants are photosynthesizing, taking carbon out of the air, taking energy from the sun, translocating that food down into the root zone, which is where that turns into organic matter and various different exudates from those roots that end up feeding everything below ground, which then feeds a lot of even our above ground life. So if you think of a normal, let's say, cornfield, soybean field, right? Think about when that field gets planted, right? Sometime April, May, it gets planted. You got a little seed, it starts to grow. Sometime by September, October, November, it gets harvested. Well, what about the rest of the months? What are we feeding those organisms? Think about that for a moment, right? Our agriculture, when we don't have something growing for that many months out of the year, what are we doing to that soil ecosystem? What about all these guys? Are we feeding them? And are we feeding them a diverse diet, right? If they get corn, soy, is that enough? You know, do we only ever want to eat white burger buns? I don't know, I don't know about you, I know about me. So there are some great analogies that can really help somebody reach farmers by just talking about our own health and how that relates. And the sun drives it all. That's where all that energy is coming from. Okay, so good structure is incredibly important. We talked a little bit about this, right? If we want that water to infiltrate, that's where we're going to get good water storage. That's where we're going to reduce flooding. This is a good, well aggregated, healthy soil. And here's what happens when those aggregates are not stable, the rain hits. Well, we're going to get a lot of runoff, because as those aggregates fall apart and fill in all those little all those larger pores, right? Then we have very small pores left, and it takes a long time for that water to get in. That's where we get a lot of runoff. We get erosion, we get nutrients running off into our streams. That's where a lot of our water quality problems come in, right? So we need to build that physically, biologically, and chemically really well functioning soil to create that function that we need. Another way to look at this is to think about a soil's resilience and resistance. So resilience is the ability and rate of a soil to return to its pre-disturbance state. So if we have a disturbance event and that soil function is at 100% of its capacity, if we have a soil with high resistance, there's going to be a bit of disturbance, but it's mostly going to just stay the same. It's going to be okay, right? You have that big downpour, and those soils are stably aggregated with plenty of pores. It infiltrates, everything's good, right? But if that soil has low resistance, that disturbance is going to do a whole lot of damage. If it has high resilience, however, it'll bounce back, and within some amount of time will come back to its normal function that it was at. However, if it has low resilience, that disturbance is going to do a lot of damage, and it's going to take a long time before it actually starts building back its function that it had previously. So when we're talking about managing our soils, we really need to see the root cause of the problem. We need to really address the functioning of our soils, and we can't do that by just adding more fertilizers, adding more pesticides, adding more irrigation. We can kind of maintain an agriculture that way, but if we have degrading soils that don't function anymore, what that tends to do is that we end up having to make up for this loss in function through very expensive inputs. So how would you tell that you're dealing with degraded soils? If you walk into a field, how do you know? How can you make sure to actually see it happening? Well, if you walk into a field and you see rills and gullies like this, that is a very clear sign of erosion. And those of you who have seen that, I'd love for you to share some of your experiences, right? If a field is washing out, right, this is a recently planted field, and this part of the field has washed out from whatever rainfall event that experienced. This right here, you can see that cracking in the ground. You can see that the soil is crusted over. It looks like it was a muddy puddle when it rained, and then it dried and cracked. That's not a healthy soil. That's not high functioning soil. If you dig up a shovel full of soil and you see plates like this that are horizontal with the surface of the soil, that's a sign of compaction, very dense soil. That's not going to allow you water in. That's not going to allow roots to fully explore that soil. If your tractor sinks into the field like this, it could be just you really shouldn't have been out there. But soils that are less healthy tend to be less able to hold equipment up because they're not draining as well. So it will take longer until you can get heavy equipment back on the field. So, you get examples like this. Same soil type. This farmer was having really serious issues being able to grow sweet corn anymore. Never mind strawberries. This used to be a strawberry field. It was not working. Diseases, pest pressure, nutrient issues. This field was not cycling nutrients or water. The microbes were not keeping in balance and not able to maintain a disease-free environment or a resilient environment. This right here is a farm where everything is working really nicely. That soil is dark and crumbly. It infiltrates well, it drains well. The difference here is this is a very diverse production system. They grow grains, vegetables, they have animals on the farm, everything is integrated, everything is very diverse. This was a conventional operation with conventional tillage, no cover crops, and basically just, summer season specialty crop vegetables, sweet corn, strawberries that are all somewhat high intensity, and no soil health management. And that ended up being a serious issue. We ended up working with this farmer to help them get back to a better functioning soil through some investments in cover cropping and reducing tillage and some other things. Another side by side, right? Here's a cover crop in the field, and this one does not have a cover crop. You can see the color of this runoff. There's some runoff happening in this field, but it's some pretty clear water, and here it's muddy. No till side by side with a conventional till field after a really intense rainstorm. You still see the puddling in this field, and here it looks well drained, right? We can't control the weather, can't control whether it rains, but we sure can manage the soil so that it's able to handle those extremes. Here's just a great story from back in 2012. The drought really impacted crops, especially where the soils were not healthy. And so these were photos contributed by Ray Archuleta. You'll see a short video from him later. He has definitely inspired a lot of people to adopt soil health management practices. And here, this is a photo from Dave Brandt, who's fairly famous by now. And he had a plenty good crop yield after quite the drought in 2012. And the next door neighbor had about a quarter of the yield of Dave Brandt's, with a lot of tillage and no cover crops versus no till and winter cover crops for 40 years. So these are the kinds of differences that we see, especially with that kind of weather. So it's an investment, right? There's a learning curve. There's some upfront costs for adopting these practices. There's really changing the way you think about the system. But if we invest in managing for healthy soils, we get a long list of benefits from that, from consistent and good production to healthy crops, reduced risk during weather extremes that we've been talking about. Field trafficability. You can actually get into that field, runoff, erosion, flooding reduction, temperature extremes, right? If you have a nice layer of mulch on that surface, the soil doesn't get as hot on a hot day. And that really matters for producers that are a little more south. It can sometimes be a hurdle to overcome when we look at systems that are very far north, Minnesota, Wisconsin, in the colder regions, sometimes no-till can be challenging because of the cold that is maintained under that mulch layer. Air quality, healthy environment, habitat for beneficial organisms, improved soil organic matter, energy savings, especially if you're reducing tillage, for example, reduced pest pressure, improved nutrient and carbon cycling are really a big one. A lot of farmers who adopt successful soil health management systems can reduce nutrient inputs, sequestering a lot of carbon, really building up long-term economic, social, and environment and viability of those farms. I think with soil health management systems, we'll be able to sustain reliable productivity to feed our 9 billion people that are expected. What's exciting is that soil health is really out there in the popular press and has been for some time now. It's really become a forefront kind of thing. It's something that a lot of farmers are at least peripherally aware of. A lot of people are really getting excited about how to transition to soils that are healthy and well functioning. And whether it's, the popular press all over, farm, sort of the farm media, there's a lot of talk of soil health. And there's a whole lot of books out there too. If you're an avid reader, you read about soil health, there is no shortage of various different books on soil health and climate change, and how soil health is the solution for so many things. There's a lot out there. So I'm going to just briefly touch on AFT's climate vision, because it really ties in with what we're talking about here. We're looking for a future where farmers and ranchers really embrace these regenerative approaches as a new kind of agriculture, right? We want that to become the conventional agriculture. We want to build healthy soils, gain resilience, that mitigate climate change, that improve farm viability. And we really want those systems to become commonplace, so that the irreplaceable land that we have in this nation is used wisely, has balanced the needs of a healthy planet, a healthy food production system, and healthy people, and various new developments, right? So I think really American agriculture will become climate neutral. That's the vision. We want it to be climate neutral or better. And I think it's possible to get there. It's going to take a lot of work. It's going to be not any one organization that accomplishes that. Everybody really has to work together on that same goal. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Bonnie McGill, our senior soil health and climate scientist, who joined us back in June to talk about this aspect. And Bonnie, I can keep driving the slides, so you go right ahead.
Great, thanks, Bianca. Hey, everybody. Yeah, so I'm gonna give you just a kind of a commercial break here to connect these soil health practices to climate change. I know climate change isn't always a motivating factor for every landowner or farmer, but maybe it is for you. And so in helping connect what you're doing on the ground with helping to reduce future climate change, maybe it'll help push you to have what might feel like maybe an uncomfortable conversation to bring something like this up, but to talking about soil health. So I pulled together some data on some Midwestern states, and I want to add that I've worked on farms in Iowa and Michigan, so I get the situation, what farms are like out there, and so we're looking at, for each state, how the percent of acres that have cover crops after corn and after soybeans for each of those states. So you can see in 2010 and then in 2018 how that percent changed. So we're going from like about 1% up to maybe like 2 or 3 there in Illinois, up to 4.8. That's great. But that's still really low. That means like 96% of the cropland acres don't have cover crops. So go ahead, Bianca, with the next thing. So basically, in other words, we need your help. All hands on deck on making progress with getting more adoption with cover crop and other soil health practices. So next slide. Yeah, so I'm going to just briefly summarize a study that will help connect soil health with climate change mitigation. So basically, scientists now can use publicly available satellite imagery to map where cover crops and different types of tillage practices are happening. They focus on the Corn Belt, but now it's expanding to the US. So that allows us to map where things are. Go ahead, Bianca. And with that, we can use these computer-based ecosystem process-based models. This one called DNDC, denitrification decomposition, which basically says, okay, you're mapping where these conservation practices are. This model allows us to take in what kind of soils it is, production system, the climate, and then adding in these conservation practices we've mapped. What are the ecosystem outcomes, especially, next one, Bianca, how does the soil carbon change with those conservation practices? And what about greenhouse gas gains or losses from those soils across the Corn Belt? Go ahead. So this is a map from the study, and basically what it's showing is with these mapped practices over the Corn Belt, they've mapped it out by Huck 8 watersheds there. They're showing what happened with soil organic carbon considering those conservation practices, cover crops and no-till between 2005 to 2017. What's the overall story of what's happening in those watersheds? And so the orange colors are showing losses in soil organic carbon, and purple is showing where there are gains in soil organic carbon. So there are places where we're doing well, there are places where we're losing soil organic carbon, but to understand exactly the role of soil health in that picture, go ahead, Bianca. This map is when they ran the model without any of those conservation practices that they mapped, as well as running the model with all the conservation practices they mapped. And then they found what was the difference between those. And so it's showing specifically the contribution of soil health to the purple map on the left. So showing that soil organic carbon difference in those scenarios where you're seeing gains due to soil organic carbon from those practices. So basically what these two maps together are showing is the green map is saying the purple map would be a lot worse without the soil organic or the soil health practices that they mapped on the right. So where we see orange there in northern Indiana, there would probably be a lot darker orange if it wasn't for those soil health practices. And so imagining, how this map might look with, going from 2% adoption to 20%, 40% and beyond is pretty cool to think about. And yeah, go to the next one, Bianca. So here, you can go ahead and click again. I think I have some funny animations there. Yeah, there we go. So this is my last slide, and wondering how much does soil health matter for climate change mitigation? That kind of showed you what's happening with soil organic carbon in the previous one. So we have tools to estimate the annual emissions from Illinois. I pulled out Illinois as an example here. Their ag, how much ag contributes to the state's greenhouse gas emissions. And it's about 9% of the state's emissions are coming from ag, 17 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents. But if we took all available cropland acres and had them adopt no-till and cover crops, this could make Illinois ag a net negative emissions, so a net sink could offset some of the emissions from other sectors in Illinois. So the graph on the right is showing conservation tillage where we current, that dark green part, that's how much current adoption we have and how much million metric tons of CO2 equivalents / soil organic carbon that is accounting for, but the gray bar above it is showing that's how much potential there is with increased adoption of no-till. And then similarly on the right there is cover crops. We've got low adoption there, so it's not very much soil organic carbon, but then there's a great potential to make an even bigger contribution to offsetting the state's net greenhouse gas emissions there. So again, that's with just 3% of Illinois cropland acres having cover crops. So great potential for more. I don't know if there's another animation there. Bianca. So the answer in brief is potentially a lot. So you can go ahead, Bianca. So I just want to add my contact information if you have more questions. It'd be great to keep in touch, and I hope that it just kind of help connect all of this to kind of this big picture with climate change. So thanks.
Thank you. And so with that, I want to head over to a few demonstrations, let you hear a couple of different voices. We have worked with a number of folks back when I was working in the soil health division. I had some great folks working in that division, and they did some excellent demonstrations. So I'm going to, I've got this bar in the way, so that makes it a little hard to see. Sorry about that, folks. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to share two videos. One is a short video by Ray Archuleta, just a nice way to engage people in just a minute of thinking about soil health. And then we'll head over to another 17-minute video by Doug Peterson, who explains a little bit more in depth that soil function. And they both demonstrate something that I think any of you could, if you wanted to, take to the field, or you could share these videos with a farmer who's really excited. So I'd love to hear how you might use that, and let's all sit back and relax.
Perfect.
All right.
I have a question to ask you. Is your soil healthy, functioning, and stable? One of the best visual diagnostic tools that I know of is the soil stability test. Here are two soils, exactly the same soil type. This soil has been tilled for 30 years. This soil has not been tilled for 40 years. It is covered with diverse plants year-round. Watch what happens when we drop the soil in the water. Notice how the conventional till soil is falling apart. The biotic glues in the organic matter are burned up by tillage. The soil pores have collapsed. Notice the no-till soil. The pore spaces are still intact. Do this test for yourself. I guarantee if you dig a little, you'll learn a lot.
There you have it. I always love that one, and do try this at home. I think really, actually, this is a really good one that, you go to your degraded soil that you might want to be trying out. Oh, I just closed it. Okay, sorry, I'm gonna have to reopen the other one. Find a degraded soil. Okay.
So today we're going to look at some demos to help us
Peterson
understand soil function.
Explaining it in more depth.
We talked about the definition of soil function. So we got a couple of trays right here. So can you see any differences in these trays? Can you see a difference in the color? Maybe a difference in the aggregation. This one, this tray is got a lot more dust to it. This tray's got more aggregates to it. So here's the deal. These two trays, even though they look pretty different, they're actually mapped exactly the same soil type. So when I went through this course several years ago, these demonstrations were one of the most eye-opening things I had ever seen. And so we're going to do those for you guys here today as part of this. So we've got two trays here. The difference is what? They're the same soil type. The difference is management, okay? This tray right here has been tilled for many years, conventional tillage, farmed every year. This tray right here is a no-till field, hasn't been tilled, hasn't had any conventional tillage in it for a long time. So we're going to take a couple of aggregates. This first demonstration is, it's called a slake test, okay? And so what it does is it measures the ability and the relationship of soil with water. It measures the ability of the soil to slake. Okay, slake is not just a term in soils. It's a term that simply means to fall away. Okay, so we've got two air-dried aggregates here, and so you can call them an aggregate. You can call them a clod. What's the difference to you in an aggregate or a clod? So to me, a clod, if you would ask a farmer, most of them are going to tell you a clod is a chunk of soil that's formed under pressure and compaction, wetness, pressure, and compaction. Whereas an aggregate is a chunk of soil, the same soil, sand, silt, and clay, a little organic matter, but it's a chunk of soil that's made up of natural processes from biology and roots. And you'll learn more about that as we go. But again, two air-dried aggregates. One comes from a long-term tilled soil. One comes from a no-tilled soil. Map the same soil type. We've got a couple of cylinders here. We're just going to set them in. And maybe we're going to set them in there. And now as the water soaks in, you can see the air bubbles coming out. So we know the water's soaking in. But already you can start to see some differences occurring. You can see the water. You can see the water in this side right here. See the individual particles of sand, silt, and clay are beginning to break loose. As that water soaks in, those individual particles are falling apart. They're breaking loose off of there. So, again, we'll just watch it for a couple of minutes here. So now think about this. These are the same soil type, mapped the same. Imagine now this field, is it going to be more susceptible or less susceptible to erosion compared to this field? Okay? Huge differences there. Yet, map the same soil type, same hydrologic group, everything else is the same. And so we'll just watch that for a couple of minutes here, again, as the water's soaking in. So you'll learn, as you go through this course, you'll learn that it's the biology that creates the glues that holds that soil together. The biology is what creates the secretions in the soil. The roots create those exudates that you'll learn about that hold that soil together. And in a few minutes, you'll see this is just going to be completely gone, okay? And as that's going, we'll kind of start talking about our next demonstration here. We'll just let that continue to fall. You can see the clarity of the water. So think about water quality downstream from this field compared to this field. This one's just completely clear, isn't it? As opposed to this one. And it's just going to continue. As that water soaks in, it creates pressure, and those individual particles of sand, silt, and clay that make up that clod begin to break and begin to fall away. Okay? So now, as we go to our next demonstration, we'll continue to let that react a little bit. So our next demonstration is an infiltration demonstration. So, what part of the soil does water actually infiltrate through? If I was going to pour water on this table right here, if I pour water on that table, did the water soak through that table? It didn't, did it? What would I have to do to this table to get water to soak through it? I'd have to drill holes in it, wouldn't I? I'd have to put holes in the table. The soil is the same way. Water can't go through a solid like this table, and if the soil is solid, the water can't go through the soil. So it has to have pore spaces in the soil for the water to go through. And so if we have a soil that in the presence of water, and think about it, this is just water soaking into this aggregate. It's not water pounding on the surface of the field. It's not water rushing across the field. If we add a little bit of disturbance, a little bit of motion, look how much, just a little bit of motion, look how much more movement we get from that soil as compared to this one. We can move it, and we may get some pieces breaking off the outside, but they're not individual particles of sand, silt, and clay. They're small microaggregates, and there's really very little discoloration, sedimentation in the water itself. Again, as compared to this one. So, if we have soil that in the presence of water, in the presence of rainfall, falls apart like that, what's it going to do to infiltration? Okay, so we've got our two rainfall simulator. We're going to put some soil in here. This is this one right here again is our healthy soil. We're just going to set some soil in here. Get a couple inches of soil in there. Okay. We've got holes here. We've got holes in the bottom. We're going to make it rain. Now we'll do the same thing with our tilled soil. We're really close here. Put a little fines around the outside just to make sure we don't have any preferential flow. Okay? So one of the things that people talk about doing tillage, you know, when I grew up on a farm, I was taught we had to till the soil to get seed bed. We had to till the soil to control weeds. We had to till the soil to take out compaction. And so you saw me put this soil in these containers right here. How much compaction is in this cylinder right now? Virtually none, right? Because you saw me. I just fluffed that soil in there. No compaction. So now we're going to make it rain. And again, as we make it rain and watch this demonstration, think about aggregate stability. That's the term that you're going to learn as you go through this course. You're going to understand aggregate stability very, very well. I think if there was only one feature that I could measure when it comes to the soil, it wouldn't be a particular nutrient. It wouldn't be organic matter. It would be aggregate stability. Aggregate stability tells you more about the soil than any other single feature, I believe. Okay? And again, so aggregate stability is how stable the soil is in the presence of water. When it gets wet, do those aggregates hold their shape, or do they collapse and dissolve? If the soil collapses and dissolves like this, what's going to happen to our pore spaces? Remember, water has to go through the pore spaces. Water doesn't flow through a solid. Water flows through the pore spaces, the voids in the soil. So, we're going to add some water here. We're going to make it rain. You can see it raining through there. So as the water, as it begins to rain in these little demonstration cylinders, so this one right here, this is our healthy soil again. The water's running through it almost as fast as it rains, isn't it? Because why? Because the aggregates, just like this one, these aggregates hold their shape and the water just goes right through them and they stay there. As opposed to this cylinder, if you look at it, we'll turn it around for you. Why isn't it? You see the water stacking up on top. Because just like this soil right here, as it rains, those soil particles, those small aggregates collapse and dissolve, sealing the surface of the soil over. Even though we had just tilled this, we had just fluffed it up, there was no compaction in it because this cylinder of soil did not have any good aggregate stability. Okay? Again, aggregate stability is the term that you need to understand. It's the most important feature of the soil. So if this was a field, this was a crop field, this water, where would all this water have gone? We're actually trying to hydraulically force water through that. If this was a field that had any slope, it would all be gone, wouldn't it? It would not be available for future crop production. It would have ran off very quickly, causing flooding, causing erosion. But yet, these two cylinders are mapped exactly the same soil type. They're the same soil type. The difference is long-term management. And that was something that we just didn't understand, you know, for decades. We thought as long as the soil was mapped a certain type, that was all that mattered. Now we understand that management influences biology, which influences aggregate stability. You know, when I started my career 32 years ago, we had the term aggregate stability, but we were taught it was an inherent soil characteristic. not a dynamic soil characteristic. Now we realize that it changes very quickly. We can take, with the management, some of the management techniques that you're going to learn about over the next few days in this course, we can take this degraded soil and maybe not make it quite as good as this, but we can turn it pretty close into 2 or 3 or 4 years. I can take this soil with all the things that we're going to talk about and come pretty close to this in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years. But guess what? I can take this soil and do tillage to it, and in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, turn it into this soil. We can degrade it that fast, okay? So now, again, and we'll sit here and watch this. This will eventually soak through, but you know, and that was a pretty hard rain, right? We had about 1 inch of water in just a few minutes right there. But our rainfall events today are coming much harder than they used to. And so do we only want to capture the nice easy rains? No, we want to capture all of the rains. We want to get them to infiltrate so they don't cause flooding, so we can have production out of them. Another little demonstration that we'll do here is it's kind of a half and half. It's a little bit of a slate demo. We take some sink strainers. We take some small crumbled up aggregates. So these are kind of mini aggregates. They're not big ones. We put several of those in here into this sink strainer. We'll do the same with our tilled soil. This is kind of like almost like a slump test if you know anything about concrete. Okay, so we've got a couple of sink strainers with some soil. Again, this side is our long-term tilled soil, and so what we're going to do is we're just going to wet them a little bit. We've got a couple of glasses here, and so you can get two or three things. Again, this is kind of like the slate test that we talked about a while ago. Give them just a minute here to let them soak. You can see the difference in the water. But then the real test comes here. Okay? We dump that one. We dump that one. And so then you look at the difference in the soil. This one, this is our good soil. Dramatic difference, right? This one right here is just mush. Compared to this one, we can actually still have some aggregates. So that's going to translate into a lot of things for a farmer. This one's going to take 10, 15, 20% more fuel to drive through this field to harvest as compared to this field. This one's going to infiltrate water a lot better than this one. Just tremendous differences. So these demonstrations, there's many others that you can do, but we have found that these demonstrations right here are really the core to this course that you're gonna go through. We do these at the beginning of this course to set the stage so that you can understand. You know, just because the soil is mapped a certain type. I work in Iowa, I work in Missouri, and I was really concerned sometimes when I went to northern Iowa. You know, they've got some of probably the best soil in the world. And I was really concerned that really, really good, high organic matter northern Iowa soil wouldn't slake. But you know what? Those worries were totally unfounded, because even those really, really high organic matter good soils, if they are tilled, they fall apart just like this. And if they're really healthy, they hold together just like this. We've had people do these demonstrations literally with soils all the way from Florida to Canada, East Coast to West Coast. And while they don't all act exactly the same, there is without a doubt the same differences from a healthy soil to a degraded tilled soil.
So I hope that just drove home some of the things that we talked about earlier today. You know, you can hear about it, you can see pictures of it, but actually seeing the soils do what they just did there in those demonstrations, I think that's really eye-opening. We've used those demonstrations all across the country for farmer groups, for industry groups. They have been brought into the White House. These demonstrations have opened a lot of folks' eyes, and I'm curious to hear from you all. I'd love to have a little bit of discussion before we go on. Taking that back to your day-to-day, where in your community have you seen signs of poor soil health? Now that you've seen some pictures, if that wasn't familiar to you before, do you recognize any of that? Have you experienced healthy, high-functioning soils? Do you know if you have farmer innovators in your community? How might you use local examples for improving soil health awareness and adoption with your stakeholders? So I'd love to have a little bit of discussion before we go on. Looking for anybody to chime in.
Bianca, this is Landon from Wisconsin. I've seen all these tests many times before, but I want to touch on that last part of your question on ways that maybe we've not seen these communicated in a way before. I really caught on to something that was included in that video about him saying it's a lot like a slump test with concrete or cement. And sometimes I think it's actually highly effective to draw correlations between other materials and soil, because sometimes it seems like landowners, even farmers, understand other materials more than they understand their own soils sometimes, because we analyze them more than we seem to analyze the ground under our own feet. And so I found that to be very interesting. I'll definitely be looking at using something like that more going forward.
Nice.
Just
Thank you
kudos
for
to
sharing that.
that.
Yeah, that's great. Anybody else had any ahas, any, oh, I could use this? Inspired
Bianca,
thoughts?
this is Chris. I just want to throw out a comment that was made by Marie a little while ago, and wonder if you can respond to it, which was, she says, long-term research in Wisconsin has shown that that no matter what the cropping system, soils are losing carbon, most notably below 3 meters. Even restored prairies are not serving as a carbon sink. Your thoughts on that?
Fascinating. I had not heard of that study. Bonnie, I don't know whether you've heard of that study. I think climate change is, would be my guess. You know, maybe I would think that it would say in that study what the cause is. That's dismaying, to say the least. But
yeah,
I mean,
this study is the WICS trials at UW-Madison, WICTS, Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems Trials. They've been going on for Dr. Josh Posner started them, I want to say in the early 80s. So it's a 40-year trial that's paired with Michigan State. And they just cannot get soils to sink carbon.
wow,
no matter what the rotational grazing, restored prairie, diverse cropping systems, we are losing carbon. Maybe some of the more diverse systems are losing less carbon.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea, I'm just very uncomfortable with the idea of promoting soil health as a way to sink carbon. I think it's better to say that we're going to lose less of it. And if soil health practices mean less trips across a field with a tractor, it's a hell of a lot easier to sequester carbon we never burned.
Right, absolutely. I think that's a big trick with it, is not losing what's already there. If we can prevent that loss, that's a really key important thing. I sure hope that that story is not the same everywhere in the world, but not many people measure down to 3 meters. Bonnie, it looks like you have your microphone off. I'd love to hear any insights from you.
Yeah, I'm not specifically familiar with that study, but I am familiar with the Michigan State University LTR, like 30-year experiment where they measure down to a meter. And they are seeing, especially from cover crops and adding in permanent no-till, which I know a lot of farms don't actually do permanent no-till, but adding carbon net sequestration over that time period. But I know that this is a big area of controversy in the literature about should we be talking a lot of our models that we use for things like the slides that I showed you, those just go down to like 20 or 30 centimeters. And so we're working on the science to incorporate those. But like Bianca said, we don't have a lot of data down deeper. But I think it's you have some really good points, Marie. And I think it's important not only to reduce emissions, but to also take that carbon that is in the atmosphere out. So if we can find a way for soils to do that, that's an important complement to reducing emissions as well.
There's a key gap that we have been diving into, which is there's a practice which is amending soils with biochar that has quite a bit of promise, because biochar is stable in soils for hundreds to thousands of years. So there's great hope. There's a lot to figure out. The application of biochar to soils has been in research mode for at least 2 decades, maybe a little more like 3 decades by now, and was originally practiced in multiple indigenous cultures, like, for example, the Terra Pretas in the Amazon basin, which are some very highly oxidized soils that otherwise don't hold on to carbon well, but the native cultures added char to those soils, and that char is still in those soils, and those are some of the highest yielding soils that don't need as much nutrient input as some of the other soils, cycle water better, hold on to water better. So there are some hopeful practices like that where, yeah, we would need to figure out how to take enough biomass and char it and get it added to soils in an adequate way, but there's at least some ways to really stabilize that carbon in comparison to what, for example, cover crops would do. But we really need to maintain the carbon where it is when we can, right? And so not tilling up additional soils is one key piece to that. And, having all of the other tools in the toolbox so that our climate doesn't continue to become warmer, which does cause higher degradation of soil organic matter, right? That's part of what we're up against. We're kind of exacerbating that spiral of more organic matter loss as it gets warmer. So definitely some tricks to work on. So thanks for sharing that, Marie. Other questions, other inspirations?
I'll just add one more thing. I think there's real value in FOMO in farming. I think that we see neighbors looking over the fence lines, and people don't want to be the last ones to do something. So I do think the whole social media and fear of missing out is real, especially if there's any sort of social pressure in communities. And if you can get some of your more, I would say, larger, more kind of like farmers that have been in the community a long time, especially very conventional farmers, once they start to do something, everybody else starts to take notice. It's important to build on the FOMO thing. So
that is an excellent point. Thank you so much for sharing that. We are actually quite excited. We have 2 very large climate smart commodity projects that we will be working on, and then several others that we have a pretty significant component in collaboration on. And one of the things that we'll be doing in 2 of those is building mentoring groups where we will find those community leader farmers that are innovative, that are adopting these practices, and help them have the capacity and the events at which they can reach other farmers in their community so that they can start to mentor those farmers. And we can get some peer-to-peer networking going through those workshops. So we're excited about that. Always open to more input. We'd love for that kind of model to be spread across. I know there's a lot happening with mentoring groups, and we'll get to do more in that space over the coming years. Other thoughts? Questions?
Well, Bianca, oh, go ahead, whoever that was.
No, that was just me. I was just making one last comment on kind of building off of the social pressure aspect of it. I think it's also important to kind of get ahead of a lot of these myths that are also coming out. When people have thought about carbon, I've run into 2 landowners already since the carbon conversation has started, and they've been promoted to try things such as burning crop residue on their fields, thinking that it was going to add biochar, which is the exact opposite of what that actually accomplishes. So some other myth busting that definitely needs to
Yeah.
get ahead of those things, because I've had to do a little bit of that over the past couple of years too. So kind of frightening when words come out that people don't really understand.
Yeah. Wow. Thanks for sharing that one. Myth busting. We should put that on our list to develop some myth buster outreach communications. And maybe you all have some myths to bust. Maybe there are some myths going around that you're not quite sure what the truths are on. We'd love to help with some of those and yeah, help do exactly that kind of myth busting. Thank you, Landon. Any other questions for the moment? Shall we dive into the next topic a little? Chris?
Bianca, I was going to jump in and ask a question, and maybe I don't know when is the right time. I've listened to that Doug Peterson video a couple of times, but this was the first time that I realized that he said, if you are that the better measurement of healthy soils is not the amount of organic matter, but the aggregate stability. And I'm curious whether there is a specific measurement of aggregate stability, like, and
Yes.
how one does that. And I don't know if you're going to talk about that later, but that just
yeah, I'll talk a bit about a couple of different measures of aggregate stability in the soil health assessment session tomorrow. And he just showed 3 that you can do in the field. Those are actually all part of the in-field assessment.
right.
There are laboratories that measure aggregate stability in a number of different ways these days. So we're starting to get some of those soil health measures available. I'm always leery, frankly, of anybody saying, this is the one measure you should do. Because if you go to the doctor and you have a broken leg and what they measure is your blood pressure, they're not going to know you have a broken leg. If what you have is COVID and they figure out that you don't have a broken leg, but they don't look at whether you have COVID, you're not going to know that you have COVID, right? We need to assess multiple different aspects of how soils function so that we can address what's wrong with the soil. So you'll always find me saying, no, it's good to have multiple measures. We don't want to just go with one measure. That said, aggregate stability is one fantastic measure, and I'm really glad that it's out there so much now, because there used to be no labs that did aggregate stability. That was not something available to the public. Organic matter has been around for a long time. It is still a good indicator. It is one that has to be interpreted in the context of the climate and the soil type, just like a lot of these other indicators. Aggregate stability does too. But aggregate stability is a really nice visual indicator, and it's a really great tool for starting and engaging in a conversation with a landowner, because it is so visual and so directly applicable with all these things that we need from our soils that we generally know about, but we've never connected to soil function. So it's a great one. Yes, there are measures. There are very controlled ways of raining on a sieve of soil aggregates of a certain amount and then measuring how much remains behind. That's a method that I was involved in testing and then integrating into the Cornell soil health assessment back when I did research at Cornell on that. There are a couple of other ways, like the sieves, the sink strainer demo. There are some similar approaches in a quantitative way for measuring measuring aggregate stability through that. There's a couple other methods of various different ways of shaking soils so that they slake and measuring what is left behind. So there are laboratory approaches, and then there are in-field, just comparing side by side, right? Your degraded field with your fence row, or your degraded field with your long-term grazed pasture, and you can get an idea of how that soil is doing.